Hello, and welcome to Dark Hearts with Stacey Lee. I'm so glad you're here. I have a very strange and dark story for you today, one that has been studied by journalists and true crime writers for decades. You're going to have to make some decisions listening to this story and decide what you believe. There are a lot of mysteries in this story, and there's a lot of tragedy. Today we are talking about the story known as the Ecclesiastes mystery. I'm your host, Stacey Lee. Let's begin. Our story begins in Tucson, Arizona in March of 1977. It's already starting to get hot that time of year in that part of the country. The cactus were blooming, kids were playing outside, and people were preparing for the long summer ahead. On the morning of March 22nd, 39-year-old Charles Morgan, a successful businessman who was president of his own escrow company, drove two of his daughters to school. He dropped them off just as he did every weekday morning, and then he vanished. Charles' wife had no idea what had happened, as Charles had a very regular daily routine and he would never disappear by choice. Charles was also known as Chuck. For 3 days, Ruth Morgan worried and made phone calls, trying to find out where Chuck had gone. And then, at 2 a.m. in the morning, Chuck appeared back at his house. Ruth later said, quote, "I was in bed and the dog started barking. I got up, went to the door and opened it, and there was Chuck. He was missing a shoe and he had a plastic cuff on his ankle. In addition to that plastic cuff on his ankle, Chuck had a plastic zip tie around his wrists." Ruth was stunned and tried to ask Chuck what was going on, but he motioned to his throat, letting Ruth know that he couldn't speak. So Ruth went to the kitchen and grabbed a pen and paper. Chuck wrote something so bizarre it was hard to believe. He scrawled out words telling his wife that he had a hallucinogenic drug painted in his throat, coating his throat, that would, in his words, drive him irrevocably insane or destroy his nervous system and kill him if he spoke. I don't think something like that exists. I could be wrong. I often am. Of course, Ruth wanted to call the police, but Chuck insisted that their entire family would be in grave danger if anyone called the cops. Ruth said Chuck wrote, and he was adamant, he could not tell her much about what had happened, or he would be signing the family's death warrant. Now, how did Chuck get this substance out of his throat so he could speak again? We don't know. Over the next few days, Ruth took care of her husband, feeding him with an eyedropper, and got him back to a point where he could speak again. And what Chuck told Ruth, absolutely shocking. Chuck said that he had quietly been working as a secret agent for the U.S. Treasury Department. Back in 1977, the Treasury Department handled all matters related to domestic safety because we didn't yet have a Homeland Security Department. That wasn't created until 2003. Chuck told Ruth that when he was taken, his abductors took his Treasury ID. That seemed to be part of the reason they kidnapped him. They wanted his ID. Chuck said he was able to escape from his captors near the Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. Chuck didn't tell Ruth much else, and he was insistent that she was better off not knowing all of the details. As the weeks went by, Chuck and Ruth tried to get back to life as usual, but Chuck became increasingly paranoid, which I guess if you were abducted and taken from your home and cuffed and all of those things, you would be. Chuck began wearing a bulletproof vest everywhere he went, and he was packing a gun. He grew a beard for the first time ever in order to disguise his face, and he insisted that he and only he take his daughters to and from school. Normally that was something he and Ruth shared the duties of, but he said, no, I'm taking the girls to and from school from now on. And then 2 months after his first abduction, Chuck disappeared again. 9 days later, Ruth received a phone call from an unknown woman who said, Chuck is all right, Ecclesiastes 12, 1 through 8. That's chapter 12, verses 1 through 8, and those Bible verses read as follows. Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them, while the sun or the light or the moon or the stars be not darkened, nor the clouds return after the rain. In the day when the keepers of the house shall tremble, and the strong men shall bow themselves, and the grinders cease, because they are few, and those that look out of the windows be darkened, and the doors shall be shut in the streets, when the sound of the grinding is low, and he shall rise up at the voice of the bird, and all of the daughters of music shall be brought low. Also when they shall be afraid of that which is high, and fear shall be in the way, and the almond tree shall flourish, and the grasshopper shall be a burden, and desire shall fail, because man goeth to his long home, and the mourners go about the streets. Or ever the silver cord be loosed, or the golden bowl be broken, or the pitcher be broken at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern. Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, all is vanity. Now, that's the King James Version. The meaning of this passage in the Bible is a reminder that life is fleeting and that the years will pass quickly. It emphasizes the wisdom of remembering God while you're young, because with age comes physical limitations, and it is a tragedy if one's prime years pass in a meaningless way. Ruth had no idea what this Bible passage had to do with her husband's disappearance, and the phone call brought her little comfort. Days passed, and then weeks, and then on June 18th, 1977, Charles Morgan was found dead in the middle of a road 40 miles west of his home in Tucson. His Mercury Cougar was found not far from his body. Chuck was wearing his bulletproof vest, but he had been shot in the back of the head with his own gun, the gun that he carried for protection. The police were called to the scene and they began to investigate. Lying near Chuck's body was this pair of sunglasses that did not belong to Chuck. In Chuck's car, cops found multiple weapons and lots of ammunition. They also found one of Chuck's teeth wrapped in a white handkerchief in the back seat of the car. That is such a strange detail to me. Did he pull his own tooth out? There was also a piece of paper on which was written the directions to the exact spot where Chuck was found, and those directions were written in Chuck's handwriting. It gets even stranger. When Chuck was undressed at the morgue in order to undergo an autopsy, the coroner found a $2 bill pinned to Charles' underwear. On that bill, someone had written a bunch of strange symbols and markings. There was also a list of 7 Hispanic names, starting with the letter A and going through G, as follows: Acevedo, Bejarano, Cajero, Duarte, Encinas, Fuente, and Gradius. You can see someone has written very small to fit all those names on there. The car also contained a map of Robles Junction, which is an area in Arizona between Tucson and the Mexican border. What is the area known for? Smuggling. And then, also on the dollar bill, you can see here, was written Ecclesiastes 12 with arrows that pointed to the 1 and the 8 in the serial number of the $2 bill. Now, of course, 1 through 8 were the verses mentioned on the phone call that Ruth had received. So what is going on here with Ecclesiastes 12 verses 1 through 8? After the investigation was over, for reasons that I can only take wild guesses at, the police ruled Chuck's death a suicide. It seems crazy, but Charles had gunshot residue on his left hand. Chuck was right-handed. Also, there were no fingerprints on the gun. None at all, not even Chuck's. How does someone wipe fingerprints off a gun after they're dead? How does someone shoot themselves in the back of the head with their non-dominant hand and then after they're dead, wipe the fingerprints from the gun? This makes absolutely no sense. Even if it was possible to shoot yourself in the back of the head, why would anyone choose such an awkward manner in which to do it? Now, the last passage in that set of Bible verses says, "Saith the preacher, all is vanity." But in the new translation of the Bible, the passage is translated as, everything is meaningless. This is why I just lose my mind when people are like, the Bible says, the Bible says. It depends on which version you're talking about, who translated it, which translator you believe is the correct one, which authors you believe. It's an old book. We don't know much about it. If you want to live your life by the Bible, that is your choice. I just hope you retain your critical thinking skills as well. I don't think there's anything wrong with me saying that. Of course, hell, who knows? I get in trouble for all kinds of stuff. Now, some people claim that Chuck had become so paranoid that it made him depressed and suicidal. Let's say that he was. I don't know that he was, but let's say that he was. That doesn't explain his initial disappearance, and it doesn't explain the phone call that Ruth received from the unknown woman. It also doesn't explain anything that was found at the scene where his body was found. 2 days after Chuck's body was found, an anonymous woman called the Pima County Sheriff's Department and claimed that she had met Chuck at a local motel shortly before he died. She told the police that she was known by her nickname of Green Eyes, and that she was the woman who had called Ruth several days earlier with the Bible verse and the reassurance that Chuck was okay. Well, Chuck was definitely not okay. The woman said Chuck did in fact come and meet her at the motel, and that when he did, he took out a briefcase containing several $1,000s in cash. He said the money was going to buy him out of a gang contract that had been taken out on his life. Now, Chuck's car had been taken to a police impound lot. While it was sitting in impound, someone broke into the car in police possession. So that in itself is very strange and brazen. Police believe someone was looking for something in the car, but that person had to have known that the police had already gone through the car and taken everything inside into evidence. But did they miss something? Was something hidden in the car? Something that someone wanted? This keeps getting even stranger. On the same day someone broke into the impounded car, Chuck's office was ransacked. Who broke into this dead man's office and tore it apart? What were they looking for? Were they not afraid of being caught during a death investigation? 3 weeks after Chuck's death, 2 men claiming to be FBI agents appeared at the Morgan house. They told Ruth that they needed to look through the house, and Ruth kind of naively let them in. These men tore through the house and searched for hours. Probably because she was afraid Ruth didn't call the police or try and verify that these men were actual FBI agents. She let them go through the house and search for the better part of the day. Ruth doesn't know if the men found anything that they were looking for. A reporter named Don Devereux began looking into this bizarre story and became convinced that Chuck was in fact murdered. When Ruth told Don about the visit from the FBI, Don contacted the FBI. He was told that no one at the agency had ever heard of Chuck Morgan. Don made a Freedom of Information Act request to the FBI, and the reply that he got was that despite the fact that he knew the FBI had interviewed Chuck's attorney more than once, there was no file, no phone number. The FBI had no information on Chuck Morgan whatsoever. Was that the truth? Don Devereux does not believe it is. Don believes that the $2 bill clipped or pinned to Chuck's underwear was the basis for some kind of a code. The problem is, the document that the code unlocks is not known. Don said, quote, "If Chuck was quietly providing assistance to the U.S. government and monitoring the activities or one or more major organized crime families, then he wasn't a villain. He was a good guy, and they need to talk about that." Organized crime. Let's talk about the theories. The main theory about what happened to Chuck Morgan is that he was, in fact, doing secret work for the government and that the wrong people became aware of this. His daughter said, years later, quote, "My father had a lot of information about people here in Tucson that could have been very detrimental. There was a lot of information about politicians, people who are still alive that work in our government. He had that information and they wanted to silence him." Of course, having damning information about government officials could explain why Chuck's mysterious death was ruled a suicide and not investigated as a murder, despite the fact that he'd been shot in the back of the head and there were no fingerprints on the gun. We know that before his death, Chuck testified in a secret state investigation looking into illegal activities by a Tucson bank. There are rumors that that bank was tied to organized crime. So let's talk about the mafia. We know that Chuck had done some escrow work for several organized crime families in the Arizona-Mexico area. Back in 1977, Arizona had this law that allowed people to purchase property with a blind trust. This meant that a representative could conduct real estate purchases on behalf of a person or organization without the escrow company knowing who that person or organization was. It seems crazy to me, but this allowed criminals to buy up real estate as money laundering operations without the sale of that property being tied back to them. I mean, I cannot wrap my head around that. We track real estate purchases very carefully for this very reason. Arizona, Utah, Wyoming are still very much the Wild West, but it surprised me to hear that in 1977, you could purchase a piece of property for someone else and nobody knew who that person was. Investigators then found out that Chuck spent about a week before his death kind of hiding out at a North Side motel. I think he left his house because he thought his presence was putting his family in danger, but they couldn't verify whether or not the woman, calling herself Green Eyes, was there with him romantically, and they couldn't verify the story about the briefcase full of cash. The cops also found out that Charles had been involved in billions, not millions, billions of dollars of gold and platinum transactions for the purposes of money laundering between 1973 and 1977. These transactions allegedly also involve CIA agents, Department of Defense agents, and ex-government officials from Vietnam who are said to have profited greatly from the war in Vietnam. Wow, who knew? Tucson, Arizona, man. It is the hotspot for crime, apparently, or was anyway. All I can hear now is Laszlo from What We Do in the Shadows saying, "This is the way we talk in Tucson, Arizona." I guess I should say Jackie Daytona said that. Don Devereux then discovered that Chuck used his position as an escrow agent to help mafia crime boss Joseph Bonanno with some very shady real estate transactions. So there is very real evidence that Chuck was involved with helping the mafia. Don also found out that Chuck kept very detailed copies of each and every transaction, not just for his own records, but also because it appeared he was intending to hand those records over to the government as part of his secret work for the Treasury Department. Did someone in the Bonanno crime family find out that Charles was keeping these records? Did they decide that Chuck needed to disappear in order for them to make those records disappear? This law in Arizona, the law that allowed blind trusts to purchase land and businesses, made Arizona very attractive for the mafia. And it is known that a lot of business was conducted during that time period for the mafia. Don Devereux continued his investigation, but it seemed that with every answer came more questions. A man named Doug Johnson left his home in Phoenix, Arizona around 11 o'clock at night to work a night shift at a computer graphics company, and he never came home. Doug was later found dead in his car in the parking lot of the building where he worked. He had been shot behind the left ear. No gun was found at the scene, and no gunshot residue was found on Doug's hands. But for some absolutely unknown and wild reason, this death too was ruled a suicide. The medical examiner wrote the gunshot wound was either self-inflicted or assisted. What? What does that mean? If there is no gun at the scene and no gunshot residue on the dead person's hands, how in the hell could this death be a suicide? And how is this death tied to Chuck Morgan? Don Devereux, the reporter who would not let this case go, lived right across the street from the computer graphics building and drove a very similar car to Doug Johnson's. It appeared very much like someone was trying to kill Don Devereux, and poor Doug Johnson was in the wrong place at the wrong time, driving the wrong car. A journalist that was friends with Don began looking into the death of Doug Johnson and found evidence he claims supports the theory that this was a botched hit on Don Devereux. Not long after this death, Don Devereux received a call from a fellow investigative journalist named Danny Casolaro working out of Washington, D.C. Danny had uncovered major corruption in the Justice Department, and he was looking for Don's information on Chuck's gold transactions. Why? Because those transactions would help him tie important government officials to money laundering operations in the Southwest. There's just so much corruption and so much covering of facts and bad deeds in the government. It's really appalling. Just days after Danny Casolaro called Don Devereux on August 8th, 1991, he traveled here to Martinsburg, West Virginia to meet someone claiming to have information on the story he was working on. Shortly after checking into room 517 at the Sheraton Hotel, Danny Casolaro was found dead in his hotel room bathtub with his wrists 12 times. The scene was so gruesome that one of the housekeepers fainted when she saw it. Danny's family was not notified of his death for 2 days. When Danny's brother Tony found out how Danny had died, he immediately said, "This was a murder. This was not a suicide." Tony said that Danny was famously squeamish about blood. He wouldn't even get an injection because he was so squeamish about needles and blood. This was not someone who was going to end their life in that manner. Tony didn't believe that Danny was in that frame of mind at all, but even if he had been, that is not the manner he would have chosen. Tony also said that Danny told him about some of his findings regarding the corruption he'd uncovered at the Justice Department, and Danny told his brother that he felt his life was in danger because of what he knew. Danny even told Tony, "If I end up dead, it will not have been by my own hand." Tony asked investigators about documents that he knew Danny had on him the day before his death. Tony had seen these documents and knew Danny was carrying them because Danny had met with an informant who had given him some very sensitive information relating to his investigation of the Justice Department. Tony was told that there were no documents found at the scene in the motel room. They were missing. I mean, at least that's what authorities told Tony. Tony believes that the documents were found and taken from the scene. Tony believes that either the killer or the investigators took the documents from the scene. Because of the manner of Danny's death, the motel room was not treated as a crime scene. The housekeepers were allowed to clean up the room as usual, destroying any potential evidence that might have been left in the room. Oh, I just had a thought of being the next person to rent the motel room, and yeah, I love taking a hot bath, but I have never used a hotel bathtub in my life because ew, and you just don't know what's gone on in those rooms. Yeah. Later, one of the cleaning staff members recalled finding blood-stained towels on the bathroom floor, which of course indicates that someone was trying to either stop Danny's bleeding or clean up the blood. Don Devereux continued to investigate these deaths, but he always hit brick walls, with investigators telling him there's no evidence to support your theories. Don firmly believes that Chuck Morgan was murdered before he could hand over the records he was keeping. Ruth told Don Devereux that Chuck told her he was aware of money laundering taking place in the Tucson and Phoenix areas, but that he wasn't involved in any of it. That does not appear to be the case. Chuck also told Ruth that the less she and the kids knew about any of it, the better. Don Devereux told a reporter, "There is a great likelihood that Mr. Morgan was in fact doing something with the government. I think this was a guy who was extremely naive about a lot of things. I think somebody blew his cover and he got killed." There is one theory that organized crime bosses put out the word that they wanted Chuck dead and a hitman was hired. That hitman then went to Chuck and told him about the hit and bribed Chuck to pay him off so that the hit wouldn't be carried out. That's why Chuck had the cash in the briefcase. He was planning on buying off the hitman. When Chuck drove out to the desert to meet the hitman and pay him, the hitman killed him anyway and then took the money. This is, of course, a theory, but I think it's a pretty good one. It's worth mentioning that Chuck was a secret witness in an extensive land fraud investigation, and he was interviewed about it in May of 1977 after he was first abducted, but before he died. Witnesses later came forward stating they saw Chuck in several restaurants and motels meeting with other men shortly before his death. These meetings were not part of his calendar, and so the theory goes that the men he was meeting were part of the mafia. Ruth Morgan and her children went on with their lives. They all continued to believe that Chuck was murdered to protect the interest of corrupt businessmen and politicians that he associated with. Ruth died of cancer in 2006. Chuck's death is now listed by the medical examiner's office as an unsolved death. Doug Johnson's death is still ruled as self-inflicted. Danny Casolaro's death became the subject of a Netflix documentary entitled American Conspiracy: The Octopus Murders. I'm going to cover that story on another episode. What do you think of all of this very bizarre string of events? I don't think there is much possibility that Chuck Morgan took his own life. I don't believe Doug Johnson did either, and I firmly believe Danny Casolaro was murdered. This is further proof that corruption in our society reaches into every corner at the top and even lives out in the open, because there are those in power who protect the corrupt, and anyone who dares ask questions or get in their way, they are easily taken care of. Thank you for joining me today on Dark Hearts with Stacey Lee. Would you please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't? It helps a lot. You know, I've got 2 podcasts. This one's called Dining with Death. This is an archival series. This is the current podcast, Dark Hearts with Stacey Lee. I post brand new episodes every Monday and Wednesday. Both podcasts are on Apple, Spotify, and Amazon. I would love it if you would leave me a review. I want to give a special thank you to my patrons. Some of you very generously support me on Patreon, and you are very much appreciated. You know, we've got our fundraiser still going, always going. Watch this short little video on my channel if you would like to find out what you can do to potentially help us solve some cold cases. January is the Monday of the year. It really, really is, but hang in there. I love you guys, and I really appreciate your support. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other, and I will see you next time on Dark Hearts with Stacey Lee. Bye.